Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to Verano 1711 podcast. This is your host, Marv, and today we have another episode, but with a different topic. I just want to say this up front. I remember going to church, and there were some statements like, John the Baptist, not a big deal, secondary figure. The big star is Jesus. So let's pay our attention toward him. But there's been some waves here in scholarship, and the gentleman right there that you're seeing on your screen is the responsible for that. Today, I am joined by Dr. James Frank McGrath. Thank you for being here and kindly accepting our invitation. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing okay. Yeah, things are. We'll not tell you about home repairs and other things that I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah.
So
Tell me about it.
yeah,
Yeah, this is awesome.
yeah. I mean, I think you're right, and the New Testament texts encourage us to move quickly past John the Baptist, and
Oh, yeah.
as Christians, Jesus is central to us, and so it's sort of understandable. And yet, part of these recent projects on John the Baptist and my ongoing work, I've just really become persuaded that if we rush past him too quickly, if we don't stop to pay attention to him, there's a reasonable chance we may actually misunderstand some things about Jesus, right? Because Jesus talks more about John and talks more about himself in relation to John than he does with any other person.
Definitely, I agree with you. So this is but this is like because we're gonna be discussing your book, and you have two books, right? And one of them is more like in the scholarly tone, shall we say?
Yeah.
And the other one is like a lighter reading. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But you're shooting at both fronts, which is awesome because many people, they don't like to see footnotes. They shy away from footnotes. I don't. I love footnotes because, as my mentor used to say, the good thing, the nuggets, you can find it right there. But for people who just want to have a light reading, it's available. And I'm dropping a couple of links there on this video, so you can go click on them. So if you want to get your own copy, please do it and enjoy yourself. So, Dr. James, just brief introduction, who you are, where you teach, your areas of expertise for people who may not be aware of you. Though I'm pretty sure, in this social media world, you've been in big venues. For example, you've been with Alex O'Connor, who's famous and strong presence here in social media, as well the good scholar Dan McClellan, awesome podcast there, Data Over Dogma. Joshua Berman, History Valley. So big names right there. So people that are aware who you are. But for those who are not, please give us a bit of an intro who you are.
Sure. So my name is James McGrath. I teach at a university called Butler University, which is in Indianapolis in the United States. And my main field is New Testament early Christianity. I started out doing doctoral work on the Gospel of John and its Christology, its depiction of Jesus. And that became my first book. And New Testament biblical studies has continued to be my primary focus. But I've worked on some side areas as well, including a group known as the Mandaeans, right? And so a group that focuses a lot of attention on John the Baptist, and I'm sure we'll dig into that a bit more. And also I've written some things about the intersection of religion, science fiction, and other aspects of popular culture. So surely there's something in there that somebody listening to this will find interesting.
I know, I'm pretty sure they will. I'm pretty sure. Now, before going into things and dropping the questions here to Dr. James, I just want to show to the people and also you, books, they get to 10, what do you call it? Reviews, blurbs, endorsements, whatever you call it. So I got a couple of them here. So let's check them out here very quick. Let me know if I can see it there on my screen. Oh, there you go. So we got Claire Rothschild. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name. I don't want to butcher it. So based on an impressive array of sources, including Mandean texts. Is it Mandean? Yeah? Okay.
I've started to say, most people say Mandean, so don't worry about it.
Yeah. Thank you. So as I was saying, based on an impressive array of sources, including Mandean text, this fresh new volume quests quests for the historical Baptists assiduously, building on prior work in a readable volume of model scholarship. Now, it is my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that Claire, she's also been doing a lot of work on John the Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
And also you interact with her work, of course. Now, look at this. This is the great, the one and only Paula Fredrickson. John of History, Baptist of Faith, inaugurates a new phase in the quest for this elusive historical figure. It is a major scholarly achievement. Oh, that's awesome. That's, I mean,
So
what better endorsement do you want from this?
yeah,
We got another one.
yeah, people may not know this, but as academics, when we see the endorsements, we don't know who they're going to get. We give them a list of people we hope might, and just I'm so touched, and really moved by what people have written.
Thank you. Now, last but not least, Jordan J. Ryan from Wheaton College. This study expands the horizons of current scholarship and will likely be referenced for years to come. Yeah, because it's massive. It's real massive. All right. So, Dr. James, let's get into the question because we want to value your time as always. I promised yesterday, I was saying to you, Professor Ransberg, we were expected to be 1 hour. And then the interview, extended a little bit more than expected. I apologize for that. And I ask them, please forgive me, but I just wanted to be very careful on that. So let's go with the questions here very quick. And the first question is going to be popping up on your screen. Let me know if you can see it as well. So in broad strokes, what motives led you to write an entire book? And I'm sighing there. An entire book on the historical John the Baptist.
Yeah. And thank you for mentioning that. In fact, I wrote 2 books. In the past, I've tended to try to write academic books that I also hoped would be accessible for a general audience. And eventually realized that if you try to write for everyone, you're not giving the scholars all the detailed footnotes because you're trying to keep them, lessen them. And you're not giving the general audience the kind of, you're going into details that they're just maybe not interested in, or at least won't be interested in until they've had a chance to just get the big picture story. But besides wanting to write for 2 audiences, I wanted to do 2 things with this project. One was to dig into some of the key details, right? So some of the more difficult and challenging questions about John the Baptist. But I also wanted to tell his story, right? And say what picture of his life as a whole and his activity and his significance emerges if the conclusions in the bigger book are correct. And so that's Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist, is an attempt to write a biography, which some have said could not be done. And that statement, right, of past scholars probably would have been enough to motivate me because I like a challenge. But the main thing that led to most directly to this project was having veered off into, and having had my interest drawn to the Mandaeans, this group that are the last surviving ancient Gnostic group that made it down continuously to the present day. And they hold John the Baptist in high esteem, and they don't hold Jesus in high esteem. And so it's been suggested that they might have emerged out of the movement around John the Baptist, and a branch of it that didn't fold into and become part of Christianity. And so as I started working on those texts, because those texts have been neglected by scholars, particularly in the English-speaking world, I knew that if New Testament scholars were going to give those sources the attention they deserved, then absolutely had to have the next project, or a project soon after, be something like this. How do those sources relate to John the Baptist? Are they of any historical value? What happens if we use them? And not making the case that they're better sources than our New Testament sources or other early sources that we have. It's just that I think they are not so late or so far removed as to be irrelevant, right? And so I think that bring them into the picture especially when we have relatively little information about John the Baptist from the early years, it just helps us sort of broaden out and flesh out the picture in more detail. And so that's the main reason for writing on this. And as somebody who's also had prior interest in the historical figure of Jesus, I think that understanding John will help us understand Jesus, and that's important to me as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you. So that's the thing, as I was saying at the beginning. We usually pay more attention to Jesus, the big name there. But this one main takeaway, if I can put it this way, is that John the Baptist may not be that marginal figure that we've been led to think about.
Yeah.
There's more to him than what meets the eye in the first place, right? And this is something you're trying to do. Now, as you said, and you pointed out multiple times, uh, he is connected. I mean, the way he's presented in the Gospels, do you think it's more like a literary figure with layers and layers, which is obviously in the goes to pointing to the purpose, how the author structured their gospel? Do you think there's more like a literary uh, figure there? Like, I mean, we can find historical nuggets, right? But this is more like literary. What would you say to that, Dr. James?
Yeah. So I mean, I definitely do think that in seeking to tell their stories about Jesus, John gets elaborated as a literary figure, and as is always the case when historians are dealing with sources, we have to ask, how much of this reflects the person as they would have understood themselves to be? How much reflects the author telling their story, explaining how they understand this individual's significance, right? How much of it is people trying to do damage control, right? Trying to emphasize, right, precisely because they believe that Jesus is the one who is to come, right? Who's destined to be the stronger one, to shift focus away from John, because in his time, John was really famous. And when Jesus first emerges onto the scene of history, just think about what Herod Antipas speculated. He was like, is John back? I killed John. How is this still happening, right? He's perceived as continuing what John did, as connected to that. And so we get some of that information. And I think there's at least something that takes us back to a very early stage. But we also can see that these authors really want to emphasize, right? Jesus must increase, John must decrease. And so in the past, historians have sometimes tried to imagine that you just sift through the sayings until you get a little nugget here, a little nugget there of genuine historical information. And if you do that with John, we'd end up with almost nothing. But I believe that as we see the ripples from his impact, including reactions against his influence and trying to downplay it, we can still trace that back, right, using sort of newer historical methods that are not as atomistic. And so I do think that we can catch glimpses of John. And I don't think that the vast majority of material that we have is so far removed from the historical figure as to not help us bring him into focus.
Thank you. One last comment, because we're talking about here the Christ maker. I like that title on the second book because it's implying, it's implying along the way. You also mentioned that Jesus, we can have this picture of Jesus being a disciple of John, but we're going to tackle that further along the conversation here. So let's move on here. Thank you for that. Let's go with question number 2. John the Baptist. Oh my goodness, the famous Q. In your answer, please just start describing what is Q. So for people who is not aware of what is that. So John the Baptist and Q and the Mandean sources.
Yeah. So for those who may not be familiar with it, the Q source is a hypothetical source. It's an effort to explain why Matthew and Luke agree, sometimes word for word, on content and also on order. Right? A lot of the material that they share in common, that is not found in the Gospel of Mark, right? Which is also thought, the Gospel of Mark is thought to be a source that was used by Matthew and Luke, but Matthew and Luke also share this other material that's not in Mark. And so the options for explaining this are, yeah, I mean, you can configure them in lots of ways with lots of hypothetical sources, but the two simplest are that either, one of them used the other directly, right? So Matthew used Luke, or Luke used Matthew, or both shared a common source, right? And just as Matthew and Luke agree on a lot of material because each used Mark independently, right, according to the majority of scholars, in the same way they might agree on this other material because they both used a common source. And that source is referred to as Q. And even if you are somebody who is skeptical of the proposal, the contents that are found in both Matthew and Luke are things that these two authors thought were worth including. And so even if they don't stem from this other source, it's still worth paying attention to. And there's a long history of treating the Q source as a collection of sayings without narrative. And yet the first content on which Matthew and Luke agree that's not in Mark is about John the Baptist. And then later on, we also get this material about John sending messengers to ask, are you the one who is to come? And then Jesus talking about John. And so instead of assuming that it's a collection of sayings and then suggesting that the narrative about John the Baptist is added later, why don't we take seriously, and this is what I argue in the book, that why don't we take seriously that John the Baptist is where this source material starts, and John comes up again later, and treat this as a source that is directly addressing something that was of great concern to the early emerging Christian community, namely, how does Jesus relate to John? And so I think that focusing on John the Baptist in Q not only helps us understand John the Baptist better, but also helps us think about Q in more helpful ways.
All right, thank you for that. Now, in the sources, obviously this is another book which has to do with the Mandean book of John. I mean, you've been very busy. I can say that. Yeah. I must be honest. I had no idea this book ever existed. I mean,
Yeah.
I just was not aware of its existence. Yeah. And then I saw this post of you. I think I posted something on the Enoch Seminar Facebook group, if I'm not mistaken. Like, this is something that is out there belonging to the Mandeans, their heritage, if we can put it this way. This is their literature, if that's okay to call it that way. And this is a critical edition. Can you please talk about that? And also if I'm not mistaken, the Nag Hammadi text, because it's also part of the conversation, right?
Sure. So if you ask people, listening to this podcast, if they've heard of the Mandeans before, they'll probably say no. A few of them might have. They might have seen your Facebook post or something, but most would probably say no. And yet if you ask them, have you heard of Gnostics and Gnosticism, they'll say yes. And that's the thing that's so shocking, right, is that most people are aware that this was an ancient religious tradition, that it was significant and influential, and that a lot of the early church writers were concerned about it, sort of as a competitor to their own views. And yet these same people don't know that there is a group that has survived from ancient times down to the present day. And this is not to suggest that they've preserved all of their rituals and all their beliefs continuously without change, right? Religions change over time. And we can actually see in studying their literature as well that it has not remained static, that these materials are not all from the same time period. But this group is so fascinating, right? And if you're fascinated by the Gnostics, even if not necessarily agreeing with them, just think this is fascinating because it helps us understand what ancient people were thinking about in this time period, then this group deserves attention, right? And it used to be that you had to go to the borderlands where Iraq and Iran meet in order to encounter them. Now there's a big diaspora, so there's a reasonable chance that some live close to where at least some listeners are living. But you can also go on YouTube and see their ritual practice and things like that. And so these sources were given a lot of attention by New Testament scholars, but in an uncritical way. And then realizing that they're late, there was a backlash against that. The pendulum swung the other way, and then they've been ignored for a long time by New Testament scholars. And one of the aims in my work on this is to find that more balanced position and get scholars to take them seriously, not as better sources than New Testament sources, but as sources that are relevant. And I sometimes make a comparison with either the Nag Hammadi texts, but also rabbinic literature, right? Rabbinic Judaism is not the Judaism of Jesus' day, but it evolved out of the Judaism of Jesus' day. It's connected to it. And so it shouldn't be plugged in. That literature should not be plugged in as though it were New Testament background, but it's not irrelevant. It deserves our attention, critical study, careful study, with close attention to dates and traditions and how things developed. And so tried to bring this in, and hopefully just by bringing in more sources into the picture in talking about John, will have made an impact and helped move things forward a bit.
Thank you, Dr. James. Now, this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is, to my understanding, the Apocryphon of John in the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas. Do they have a lot to say about the historical John? How do you evaluate these sources? At what level? How useful they can be to your academic work?
Yeah. So, as is also true today, there were a lot of Johns then, and
yeah,
and it's easy to get them confused. And so, the Apocryphon of John, right,
Yeah.
is dealing with something that's connected with sort of John the Apostle, right, one of Jesus' disciples. The Mandaean Book of John has a central section that's focused on John the Baptist, right? But in the Nag Hammadi text, we do have things. There are some things about John the Baptist and some engagement with him. Some at least somewhat critical, but a lot of it, positive. But there's more than that. It's clear that baptism, right, and rituals related to baptism, right, anointing and things like that, were part of Gnostic religion. And that continues to be true of the Mandaeans today, right? Their baptismal practice. And so even when he's not mentioned, his ritual, his rite, right, the thing that he was proclaiming and teaching and practicing seems to have made an impact. And so I think that the Nag Hammadi sources, again, they're later than the New Testament sources, but they show something of John's impact and the breadth, right, the reach, the extent of his influence.
Thank you so much for that. All right. So people, you can check out the do we have a section, I think, in Braille, if I'm not mistaken? There's a whole section dedicated to the study of Nag Hammadi texts in Manichaean literature, if I'm not mistaken. This is not a question that I prepare in advance for you, but I need to ask you: it's the debate settled regarding the Gnostics' origins, or this is a very controversial matter still within academia?
It's still a controversial matter,
Okay.
and I hope that I may have helped contribute to solving it.
Yeah.
So the Mandaeans are the only group that has preserved its literature and its ritual, its prayers, its liturgy in a dialect of Aramaic, right? And so it gives us a different linguistic context than the Nag Hammadi texts, which are in Coptic, which is the Egyptian language. And one of the fascinating elements is that we have references to like celestial beings that sound like they have like ancient Israelite names, right? And so the biggest puzzle about Gnosticism, like most religion, said that there was one supreme good divine source of all else that existed. But its major difference from Judaism and Christianity was in positing that the creator of the material world, one who not so much is bringing it into existence out of whole cloth, but who shapes it and then rules over it, is a negative figure, right? And goes along with a negative view of the material world. And the big puzzle about Gnostic origins is, how can you be so interested in the Genesis creation stories that you give them this attention and focus on them so much, and yet not like the deity that's depicted as creating there? It's just such a puzzle, right? How do you get these things together? And what I think the Mandaean sources point to and help us, come up with, is that one of the streams of influence was, or would have been, those who preserved ancient Israelite traditions that either just were not directly influenced by because they were so rural, or directly rejected the development of monotheism, right, which was imposed when you have the publication of the Torah and other things. And if we look at the places, if we think about where that could have persisted, places like Samaria, right, where you don't have Jerusalem's influence as directly and as strongly. And Christian tradition claims that Gnosticism gets started with a figure named Simon from Samaria. And John is connected with Samaria. And so I don't think that John was a Gnostic, right? That's not my view. But I think it emerges among his followers, right, in the circles around him. John seems to have focused on, it's like, you're spending all your time debating about these little details and doctrines, and you're neglecting doing what's right. Do that, right? And then we'll focus on the other stuff. And so I imagine that people with diverse views gathered around him, and some of those after he died, would have splintered and become various movements. And I think Gnosticism emerges in that context.
Thank you for that, Dr. James. Let's move on here. So with the third question, in your book, you write about Jesus as John's disciple and witness. What are the implications, either theologically or historically, of these images that are not usually considered beyond the limits of academia? Yes.
Yeah, that's a big question. Let me start with the one that's probably would be the more urgent one on some people's minds, right?
Sure.
Imagining Jesus learning from anyone, right, is often, it just bumps up against a view of Jesus that they hold, where it's like, Jesus is God, striding the earth. He doesn't need to learn from anyone. Right?
Yeah.
And yet that ends up denying his humanity, right? If you say that, and this reflects another contributor to my eventually turning my attention to John the Baptist, did an earlier book on what Jesus learned from women. And started out with his mother, because if he didn't learn from his mother, then we're not dealing with a human being, right? This is not a real historical human being. Everyone is shaped by their mother in ways that we may not even remember, right? If we, depending on, and certainly more than we'd remember, even if we were privileged enough to have our mother survive until until we're old. And so this is important because there are a lot of Christologies that people who think their view of Jesus is orthodox, and actually it's really quite heretical, at least as far as the classic creeds are concerned, right? Never mind thinking about the historical question, right, which I think should probably be potentially enough. But even if you're concerned with what the creeds say, right, it's like fully human, right, as well as fully God, right, and nobody has figured out how to say both those things simultaneously without it becoming a big puzzle and making missteps.
Yeah.
But the problem is that oftentimes, because we don't know what to do with that, when we can't fit the two together, we say, well, that can't have been the case because he was God. Well, that can't, and we throw out all the human things, and we never do the reverse, right? And we end up in practice denying his humanity. And I think that's theologically problematic, right, in all kinds of ways. And so I think it's theologically important to recognize that Jesus had a genuine human life, and that's far from being heretical. That's orthodoxy, as well as a conclusion we would draw based on the historical evidence. You also asked about Jesus as John's disciple and witness, and I think the thing that's interesting is that most Christians, myself included, earlier in my research, tend to ask, if we're going to pay attention to John, it's like, okay, let's give him a little bit of attention so we can figure out what he can tell us about Jesus. And yet the amount of continuity, right, the way that Jesus sort of connects himself with John, I think that Jesus, looking at Jesus' teaching, actually can help us sort of fill in a bit more of our portrait of John as well. And so thinking of Jesus as source of information about John, I think is helpful for the historian interested in John as a historical figure, but also even if you're mostly interested in Jesus, filling in the portrait of John enough to get the sense that, you know, there's this continuity between them helps us frame Jesus in I think a more accurate way.
Thank you so much for that. Oh, by the way, I would love to have a conversation about that book, What Jesus Learned from Women. We desperately need that. Okay, so topic number 4, an ancient infancy narrative about the John the Baptist, John's immersion, origin, and meaning. What can you tell us about that, Dr. James?
Sure. So in the Gospel of Luke, right, the Gospel of Luke starts with, you know, this sort of historical preface from the author. Yeah, I'm writing these things, you know, presenting this account, having researched everything, so that you may know the truthfulness of what you've heard about these important events that occurred among us, right? Dedicated to someone named Theophilus, who is sort of the sponsor, the patron of this author's project. And it doesn't turn to Jesus. It doesn't turn to Joseph and Mary. It turns to Zechariah and Elizabeth and the birth of their son, John. And so the Gospel of Luke begins with John the Baptist, right? And the Gospel stories tend to start there. But the focus on John in that infancy material, there's often been the suggestion by scholars have explored the possibility that Luke may have had material that he drew on, that he didn't just create himself, right? Stories, maybe even written sources. And moving beyond Luke, in the next century, there's this work known as the Proto-Evangelium of James, or the Infancy Gospel of James. And it's focused on Mary and her parents, and then the birth of Jesus. And then at the end, it just suddenly says, right, when Herod is looking for the infants, suddenly it says, and Elizabeth knew they were searching for John. And then she flees with him, and then Herod sends word to Zechariah, and then eventually has Zechariah killed because he won't tell where his son is. And Jesus and his family just disappear. And the long-standing view is that this was a fragment of a Baptist source that was stuck on the end there. And as I was working on this project, I realized there was another possibility that we hadn't considered, because it's very weird that you'd have this Baptist material, right? That's not Baptist in the modern sense, but, you know, John the Baptist focused material.
Yeah.
And
thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, and have it just be able to pick up exactly where this Christian material left off. And so my suggestion in the book is that maybe this is like the original source material that this author was working with, coming through in a less edited form. And that the reason why Mary's parents just resemble Zechariah and Elizabeth so closely, it's not just the influence of the story of Hannah, right, the mother of Samuel from the Old Testament. It's the fact, you know, this may have been a John the Baptist focused source from the beginning that someone has reworked in order to shift the focus away from him and turn into a source that's about, you know, a sort of a more Christian forerunner and focusing on Mary and then eventually on Jesus. And so I think, you know, and at one point I considered like scrapping this book project and saying each of these chapters needs to be a book of its own, because I think there's so much more to say. But I realized that nobody's going to want that book unless I do this first. And so, but there's a lot more work to be done on questions like this. Yeah. And so I think that we can, by bringing the Mandaean Book of John, it has infancy material about John. The Proto-Evangelium of James has infancy material. Luke has it, you know, and bringing all this together, we can start to get at least the outline and maybe some of the details of a John the Baptist focused infancy story. And essentially suggest that we do the same thing with John's immersion, right? That we have Mandaean baptism, right, as is practiced in later times. We see hints of the baptism that was practiced by other Gnostic groups, according to Nag Hammadi. We have Christian baptism. And none of these, I don't think, precisely preserves exactly what John did in every detail, right? Each has developed things. But Christian baptism, right, emphasizes being united with Christ in his death and resurrection. That was not the symbolism of John's baptism, right? And so figuring out how to trace the trajectories of each of these traditions and the baptisms in each of these traditions back to see if we can get John's into clearer focus. That too is something I tried to do in the book, but also which I think, whole book on, triangulating baptism backwards. Yeah. And I'm, to be honest, there's more here than I'll manage to do the years that I have left to me. And so nobody should hesitate to jump in to work on these things, thinking, James McGrath will probably get, no, we need more people doing this. Please, contribute to this.
They say that when it comes to scholarly work, is not always an isolated task. It's a collaboration with many hands. Many people collaborating. Now, in my opinion, perhaps as someone outside academia, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have set the bar really high because 2 volumes, one scholarly, the other one for a wider readership. So there's a lot to be done. And the good thing, as one of the endorsements put it, is that this has expanded, the horizon of studying this historical figure as John the Baptist. So it's a lot. Hopefully, you can see some other scholars chiming in, with their scholar work, and increasing the breadth in scholarship about this figure. I want to continue here, James, with the following question. We're doing great. And this one has to do what are some interesting things we should know about Jesus' baptism according to the Mandaeans?
Yeah, so the Mandaeans do have a version of the story of John baptizing Jesus. And what's really interesting about it, it's clearly polemical, right? And it's
oh yeah.
And they're aware of I think they're aware of the Christian version of the story and are telling it in a subversive way. And there are lots of details that one could go into, but I think what's most interesting is that we see John in that story, as we find in the Mandaean Book of John, basically blaming Jesus for things that may have only happened later, like it may have been things his followers did. So we see in the Didache, it still treats baptism in flowing water, living water in Aramaic, as the default. But it says, and if you don't have that, use other water, right? And what starts as a concession, it's like if you don't have that available, you can still do the baptism thing, eventually becomes what most Christians do, right? They stop baptizing in rivers, they have baptismal fonts in churches, things like that. And I think that what we see in the story is the division between these two groups. As one moves, becomes as long as there's water, it doesn't really matter. The other one's like, see what happens when you make allowances? We have to be stricter, right? And so, I'm, another one of the big questions that I tried to answer, guess, or hypothesize, surmise answers wherever I could. But which of the things that Mandaeans and Christians disagree about, which ones reflect disagreements from John's time and which ones reflect debates that emerged later? And there were none of the things where I thought that Jesus actually deliberately departed from John's practice in a way that was antagonistic, negatively opposed, was opposed to it, right? So Jesus did things that went beyond John's teaching, but he didn't do anything that went the opposite direction from John's teaching, I don't think. And that's
okay.
And so I think that Jesus and John sort of were pretty much on the same page for the most part.
I kind of wonder, perhaps this is my modern impulse, but I kind of wonder how the historical John viewed Jesus in terms of divinity. I mean, the gospel, they are, again, they are, coloring John in a way that serves their own literary agenda, the message they want to get across with the way they propose the structure, the gospel. But I personally kind of wonder how he would view Jesus in terms of the big guy, the God of Israel, and him as a human being. Perhaps I don't know what you can say about this, but perhaps we have some glimpses when he sees Jesus coming, approaching him. You know, this is the one that I'm not even worthy of. I'm tying his shoes or whatever. And then we got this scene. That's why I picked up this picture that is right there on the
Yeah.
screen. We have this. How can we call it? Theophany, divine encounter, or
Yeah.
supernatural moment. The Holy Spirit
Yeah.
coming down from heaven. So I wonder how he would digest that scene
Yeah.
if it in true happened that way.
Yeah. And I think so. Among the key questions, one is this something that like was a unique experience that sort of singled out Jesus, or was this the kind of experience, the kind of transformative encounter with God that John hoped that people in general would have when they underwent his baptism? Right. Uh, it seems to me, and this I know is going to sort of shifting ahead to the next question, but John seems to have envisaged a greater, stronger figure coming after him, right? And how to configure that is one of the other key questions, right? Is that the Davidic Messiah coming after John is a sort of a priestly Messiah? Is John more like a prophet, like Samuel, like the one who anoints the king? And so, and is the stronger one who comes, since John styled himself as Elijah, is the stronger one Elisha, right? Who it's like, Elijah was talking a lot and did a little bit of engagement with things, but Elisha is the one who really brings about the regime change and creates a school of the prophets and does all this, and takes it to the next level. And so there too, I think there's room for continuity, right? Jesus understanding himself to be the fulfillment of what John was hoping for, and not merely just the continuer of what John started.
Thank you for that. Let's continue here. Let me know if you can see the topic number 6. I like this one very much. The Son of Man who is to come, John the Baptist, and the origins of Gnosticism.
Yeah.
I say I like this very much because of the first line, Dr. James, because I'm all into Christology.
Mhm.
I want to know who Jesus was, why he claimed what he claimed to be. I'm very interested about that guy because you and I take our faith very seriously, and that's why we do. That's why we do what we do. You from your your profession, as a New Testament scholar, me as an educated non-specialist. That's the way John J. Collins called us. And so, hit us with that. What do
Yeah.
you have to say in your book
Yeah.
about the Son of Man and the origins of Gnosticism with
Yeah.
John the Baptist?
Yeah, and I talked a bit about that already, so I think we can
Sure.
come back to the origins of Gnosticism. But picking up on that thread of the one who is to come, it's like John, according to the Gospel, said, "There's one coming who's stronger than I, who's has the the threshing fork and will clear the chaff and gather the wheat." And so it's this depiction of judgment. Right? And one strong reason for historians not to conclude that this is the gospel authors making something up so that John predicts Jesus is that Jesus didn't do the judgment thing, right? They, in the end, had to say, he will come again, and he will finally do that, but he hasn't done this yet. Right? And so I think that the Son of Man tradition in the Gospels, in the Q-source, throughout the Christian tradition, is really about how Jesus relates to John's prediction. Because of the way it's rendered into Greek, the Son of Man becomes a title. Right? But in Aramaic,
Yeah.
there was no way it could function as a title. Right? It was an expression for human being. If you read the Syriac Gospels, the expression is there in all kinds of places where the Greek doesn't have it. Right? And so it's when Jesus talks about the Sabbath, says, you know, the man was, the Son of Man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for the Son of Man, right? And so it's using for human being there, for someone. Right? And so what I think happened is, I think that John, when he talked about, one is coming, he would have said, there's a Son of Man coming, there's one coming, someone coming. And then Jesus, when he talked about, the Son of Man is here, right? So there's this hint of fulfillment of John's prediction. The Son of Man must suffer, right? And so this figure who's coming is going to be a lot more like John the Baptist, who also suffered and was executed, than people might have expected. And then there's also the sayings about, when the Son of Man comes and his holy angels with him, he'll sit on his glorious throne, and so these things about second coming and parousia, right, and things like that. And so you get this sense that all of them are engaging with John's prediction and saying that on the one hand, the figure that John talked about is going to suffer in ways that we didn't expect John to suffer. And so it's in a sense, it's going to help us make sense of what happened to John as well as what happens to Jesus. And then the things that you expected that figure to do are not, like, don't go away just because Jesus is crucified, right? And so there will be this fulfillment of the expectation. And so I think that the Son of Man sayings, right, they're also something of a longstanding scholarly puzzle. And I think that here too, connecting it with what John the Baptist predicted helps us make sense of that and figure out what's going on and why the things are said using that expression that are said in the Gospels.
And as there's this is a long debate about the significance. I mean, entire books have been written just tackling this subject matter to just to know exactly what are the implications, what the meaning of this phrase. I don't think the debate is settled. A couple of big names come to my mind. The late, I think he was an atheist, Maurice Casey, I think it is. Larry Hurtado, another big scholar, he was passed away, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so on. Professor Boccaccini also has contributed and edited volume, collecting some essays from international scholars. So this is a big debate. Now, I want to ask you, perhaps this is, again, my layman impulse, but do the followers of the John the Baptist consider or view him as the Son of Man? Do we have evidence to even think about that, or it's just way beyond the picture?
Yeah. So, I mean, the expression comes up in, because Mandaean literature is in dialectic of Aramaic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Find the expression. It's not used as a title, but we wouldn't expect it to be a title in Aramaic. What we do see is, on the one hand, John is not like the founder of the religion, right? He's a prophet. He's the latest proclaimer of the message of righteousness and of a ritual to reconnect with God when you've wandered away. That, according to most Gnostics, right, if not all Gnostics, goes back to Adam, right, and to primordial times. And so he himself is not a focus in the same way. And yet we do get some sayings, right, or some material in the Mandaean sources that suggests that John did miracles like Jesus did, right? And that maybe even, certainly had a miraculous conception and things like that. And so how much of that, how much of, what Christians wrote was them already engaging with things that were starting to be said about John already in New Testament times? How many things are Mandaeans responding to what Christians are saying and saying, well, John is greater than Jesus, therefore he must have been, I mean, we get this back and forth when you have this opposition. And once you have the later literature, it can be hard to figure out, sort of who started it and, what form it take in earlier times. So there too, there's clearly interaction, and there are similar claims, and tracing the history of that is yet another thing that, don't need, doesn't need to be a scholar who's going to dedicate their whole life to this sort of thing, right? There are lots of people dabbling in this field. If you do anything in New Testament, ancient Judaism, ancient Gnosticism, just do a little bit with the Mandaeans and or with John the Baptist. There's so much to be done. Make a contribution.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right, so think we're doing great here. Let me pop the screen here. Should appear. Let's see. Oh, there you go. So this is the last but not least, final question. What new vistas do the prayers of John the Baptist allow us to explore?
Yeah. So we have more prayers attributed to John the Baptist than most people are aware of. In the Gospel of Luke, we're told that the Lord's Prayer, so the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples, was a response to a request. They say, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples to pray. And since Jesus is connected with John, this isn't necessarily saying, teach us exactly John's words, but it is recognizing that there's a connection, and it's a request for Jesus to offer something to them that reflects what Jesus heard from John, right, and knew from John. We also have, in the Syriac Christian tradition, a couple of prayers. There's several, but there are two main ones, and it's basically impossible to date because they just show up in these collections of prayers. But they start with John teaching his followers to pray, addressing God either as Father, right, Abba, or Holy Father, right, which are expressions that we get in Jesus' prayers in the Gospels, right? And so the Syriac Christian Church kept alive in its own prayer tradition this idea that the prayers of Jesus, right, the prayers of John were precursors to and were similar to, in these ways, the prayers of Jesus. And then we also have prayers in the Mandaean tradition that also give us something. And so I think there's a lot there, and that's, again, just worth exploring. And even if you're not interested in the historical question, I mean, just discovering, I think, finding ancient prayers, including ones from the Christian tradition, but maybe in a different branch of it than is your own, is something that can be very rewarding spiritually, and not just for those who have historical interest.
Yeah. All right there. Okay, so that's all the questions again here. As I always say to here in the podcast, no episode can do justice to any topic that we may bring up to the table here. But we're doing just to, help to elucidate doubts, to bring accurate information from the scholars themselves, to give the platform so they can speak about their scholarship, their work. And by the way, I need to ask you before letting you go, Dr. James, what's in the pipeline?
Oh, yeah. So I have several things I'm working on, and there's definitely going to be more
fiction.
But yeah, there's some fiction too. But yeah. There's and I do dabble in writing fiction. So if anybody's interested, I will happily, they can either find it or I will help them find it. But I'm still working on historical Jesus, and have a project that's in the very early phases about humor and riddles in the teaching of Jesus. I think there's more to be said on that subject. It's not a new topic. It's not something that no one's worked on before, but I think there's more to be said and some interesting possibilities there. There's going to be a new series that Erdman's will be launching soon, which I'll be editing and contributing to, which I won't say more about because they probably want to make the official announcement first. But also working on something, the John the Baptist thing that I hope to get to next. There are other Mandaean texts that we'll hopefully work on translating. But also in Islam, John has the name Yahya, and you also get that in Mandaism. And the question of where it started, has often been answered. It's often assumed that it was an Arabic name, and then Mandaeans borrowed it from the Muslims. But in actual fact, it may be the other way around. Maybe a Mandaean name that ends up in the Quran. And so there are some interesting things there that could contribute both to our understanding of the history of Mandaism, but also to Islamic studies. And so
keep us posted, please. Keep us posted. Yeah. For those who don't know, also I'm gonna be dropping links about your website, all your social medias, so can people go there and keep it out with what you keep posting. You're very routinely posting things, very interesting things there in your social media venues. Yeah. So Dr. James, it's been awesome. Thank you for your time. Thank you. Perhaps people say this is a cliche thing, but I I can't help but being thankful to your scholars because you're very busy people, and the fact that you make a space for us, that speaks volumes, and we remain thankful. And all we can do is just to try to, to give this platform open space for you to come and talk and spread the word. So I just want to say thank you for being here.
Well,
Final remarks on your part.
well, thank you very much as well. I mean, if we write stuff and nobody knows about it, nobody reads it, not a lot of good. And so grateful both for the fact that there are educated lay people like you who really do take the time to really inform themselves about this, then share that with others, right? I tried to have a podcast at one point and realized I'm better off just making guest appearances on other people's podcasts because, I mean, not everybody has the time to dedicate to really doing it and doing it well and
Oh
regularly.
yeah.
And so, you're doing a service, you're doing something that I would have loved to do if I had time. And so I have more time for writing precisely because
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
doing the
No,
podcasting. And so
keep
I'm
writing.
grateful as
Keep
well.
writing.
Okay. Well, let's keep inviting interesting guests on, and I look forward to talking more at some future
Oh
point
no,
about something else.
this platform is for you all scholars, and as long as you have new scholarship in the pipeline there and being published, this space is for you. So again, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Now, for audience, just like, subscribe. That's the way you can support what we do here. Uh, this is our passion, just like Dr. James' passion is to write and talk about and teach, which is more important in the classroom. And just keep with us and keep supporting what we do. Check out our future interviews. Remember, we already kick off the new section here, which is Pistis Orientalia, where it's a whole section dedicated to ancient Near East studies specifically. So keep watching, and that will be until the next time. Everybody, take care. Bye bye now.